My name is Hod Greeley. A fair number of you know me already. Developer advocate here at Couchbase. And tonight, the idea here is to get people comfortable with the Couchbase Mobile stack. So I did say hands-on. I'm going to be going pretty quickly through this because there's a lot of material, so I actually don't expect people to follow along. But I will be showing hands-on in the sense of getting down into some nice command line stuff. And really just walking you through, so you're familiar with all the stages. You've seen kind of all the steps. So when you go back to it, you're comfortable and kind of know that what you're seeing makes sense. To start with, I'm going to do a very quick run through on this. Who is actually familiar, or who is not familiar with? Actually, I'll ask it the other way around. Who feels comfortable with NoSQL? Feels like they know it pretty well, or? So most people here are already.
So big. It's so big. What
So big. What am I asking? Okay.
We're going to take a test.
Go ahead. Name the four categories, the four common categories of NoSQL. And
Do you really mean NoSQL or no rel?
We have something we're talking about.
I'm going to stick with the NoSQL here. Okay, so I'll skip through some of this. So just to orient then, Couchbase in the subclass of NoSQL is a document-oriented database. This means we deal with JSON, which is really nice because it maps better to the languages that we program in. Flexible schema, so very easy to make changes and adapt your database to your needs as your needs change. Just to give an idea, so this is kind of traditionally how you would split typical information like this, user information, break it up in a relational system into tables, and hopefully it's reasonably apparent that that doesn't map very well to objects in things like Java and such. Whereas in a document database, you pretty much map, JSON was built to map typical data structures. The structures that you would use to represent this kind of information are easy to express in JSON. And that's what goes into the database. And we'll actually get to see that later on. So what were some of the factors that kind of drove NoSQL in the first place? So two things, the idea behind this, and on kind of the mainstream side, not mobile, was simply scaling and distributed use. So the idea that NoSQL databases, because you can shard your documents across multiple instances, and when you replicate data, it's very easy to do. And so you can scale these things much less expensively than trying to scale out by adding more machines rather than scaling up by just trying to increase the beefiness of your hardware. But as mobile developers, I like to talk about some of the challenges that are a little bit more specific to mobile. So here I kind of like this. This is a metaphor for two reasons. One is the idea that if you're out in the boonies, you're not always connected when you're mobile, right? So this is one challenge. Or the fact that even if you are connected, your connection may not be very good. It's like, who wants to run across this bridge really fast? I'm not going to try it. You can. So those are some of the challenges that we face in mobile development these days. If you have an app that's really exploding, you've got potentially hundreds of thousands, millions of users. Your app's going to be used around the globe, so access to data and back-end systems, having it be distributed is helpful, but more importantly, actually having fast access on the device becomes really important, even when you're not connected. That does bring with it an interesting problem that you don't see in typical enterprise back-end systems, which is this notion of conflict resolution. So what's happening actually in Couchbase Lite, so Couchbase Lite is the mobile embedded database. I'll get to that, covering the whole stack in a minute here. What's happening is that you can have, if you're offline specifically, especially, you may have more than one party, updating the data at a time. And so we use something that's called multi-version concurrency control, and this is a little bit like, kind of like GitHub. So if people are familiar with GitHub, or Git, I should say, not GitHub, but it tracks all of your history in some sense. And so when you actually make updates to things, typically people create branches, and that's what's happening automatically in Couchbase. Is in effect, you're creating new revisions, and those revisions can end up on different branches with a different past history. And so eventually, when you have the situation where you're disconnected and two different parties make changes, you end up with this situation where you have to resolve conflicts between the data. And so that's one of the things that I actually wanted to show a little bit is when we get into the deeper level, is actually showing some data in conflict and how you will see that in the system. Couchbase is really nice in how it allows you to deal with conflicts. It's basically, when we say automatic, there is kind of a default rule for which of these versions you'll see presented to you. So like in this case, because you had a revision that ended with a document getting deleted, that's the special tombstone that keeps track of that, you'll actually end up getting this one presented to you. If you fiddled it around enough, you can end up like removing things or whatever, you might actually end up seeing this version instead. So that's something to be aware of, is that sometimes it surprises people that they delete a document or something, they manipulate it in some way, and suddenly they get something they weren't expecting because they don't understand how the revisions work. But we give you lots of control over it, so you can get informed that there's a conflict when you're looking at a document, at which point you can just resolve it in your app directly. You can do it in the cloud, have an external system that's actually monitoring your database and goes in then and changes it for you. Or manually, that's basically presenting it to a person and letting them figure it out. And then, I don't know why, I almost always stay away from these kind of blurbs, but I kind of like this one, just because the offline, it was interesting to watch the progression of going from, the mobile universe bringing up this idea of mobile first, and now people going to, offline first. So it's, in effect, that you think of it in terms of the bar for your experience being raised, that when mobile was first around, it was kind of okay when the experience wasn't great when you weren't connected, because that's what you had and that's what people lived with, but now we can do better than that. So this is the Couchbase Mobile stack, and I'll actually just jump past this and go straight into talking about each one. So Couchbase Lite, key things to know, it's actually an embedded database, so you're using it on the device. You can actually use it completely standalone. It's a great substitute for things like SQLite. I think it's a lot nicer to work with, even if you don't care about ever connecting off the device. This was actually built specifically for mobile platforms, for IoT, and actually works across a lot of desktop platforms as well. So we have the Java version that you can use for desktop applications, and built, but with, designed for this specific kind of application from the ground up. Sync Gateway is the kind of glue that takes you from your on-device Couchbase Lite database to your backend server. And Sync Gateway is actually really cool because you can do a lot of stuff in Sync Gateway. We talk a little bit about the sync function that lets you implement business logic at this position in the whole chain, as opposed to having to do everything necessarily on device or with the server set up. In particular, I think like Fujio will talk some maybe about channels. I'll talk a little bit about channels, but channels are something that are an important way to kind of organize how you stream information out to particular devices. And that's essentially controlled by Sync Gateway. Some people go so far as to call it a microservices architecture, because that's the name of the popular buzzwords these days. But choke, I don't know. You can do a lot of really neat stuff with it. So, and then Couchbase Server, of course, is our enterprise scale. Actually, we just recently got named again by Forrester as a leader in the space for enterprise. So you're feeding into not some patched together database on the backside. You're feeding into things that big enterprises use. And then we actually have security from pretty much end to end. You can do on-device encryption with SQL Cipher, and actually you've got typical TLS for covering your internet or your network connection, and so on. And there's a lot of control over, like, you can assign user roles and things like this in Sync Gateway, so you have a lot of control throughout the stack. And finally, just to kind of re-emphasize with this visual together how it connects. So really, Couchbase Lite being on your device, Sync Gateway being kind of on the edge of your cloud and feeding into your backend system. And here are just some use cases to prompt. I'm always a little hesitant to go over these because I run into so many people with really interesting use cases that I never think of. But some, just the important ones. So, like we've already talked about, offline data access, local caching. So actually, the caching thing, I had this. Now I have to remember what it was, and I've forgotten. I had this actually interesting use. So the notion that oh yeah, for I have to write something about this. It occurred to me you could use this for A/B testing in a way. If you configure your your interface to work off of some triggers in the database, you can be pushing updates. So instead of waiting for a user to update their application through the store, you could actually pick your users and push to them through the database. That's kind of an interesting approach to doing that. Another one I want to highlight that's leads to some neat use cases that are just completely not on the radar for enterprise or classic enterprise, but maybe in the future, is the peer-to-peer capability. So that's something like in an environment where, say, a hospital where you may not, for reasons, sometimes they restrict use of networks in particular areas, but you can actually have the devices talking, essentially build out a network themselves, and so you can have a device, in effect, a network that's expanding with you as you move around. Or something like that. So there's a lot of kind of cool situations where you may not have the traditional network set up that you would expect, and so the peer-to-peer use can let you do some cool things. I'm going to go ahead and say thank you, not because I'm done, just because I'm done with the slides. And actually, if people want to tweet to me later, because with the Twitter thing, I'll trigger people to tweet, so hopefully we can fill up the data and see some stuff. Okay, so now, like I promised, I wanted to actually walk people through and show everything basically that you'd expect to see as you set up and get ready to use this. So the idea again here is that you can run all of these components I'm going to run it all on my laptop, and with the default settings that basically it comes set with, you can be up and running in actually just a few minutes. I'm going to go a little bit beyond just setting it up and actually show ways to explore some to familiarize yourself with the database. You can use curl to do some of the things that I'm going to use. There's another tool called HTTP, I don't know how you pronounce that, HTTP, HTTP something. That's actually it produces prettier output and is a lot easier to use in curl, so I recommend taking a look at that. Here are some nice links. Again, hopefully these will be visible in the video, and I will eventually post a bunch of this stuff so you'll have access to all this stuff. So let's get to it. So I'm just going to show the installation for Macs because, of course, developing for mobile, majority people have Macs. But you can actually find some, in fact, part of the resources I have here are a couple of videos that Nick did. Say hi, Nick, he's back there. So Nick and one of our other advocates, Matt did the one for Windows, Nick did the ones for Linux and Mac. So all this stuff works across all those platforms. So if you're going to download Couchbase Server, you wind up, going to our site, you go to the download page. I'm actually going to show everything using the community edition. So you go over, because this is the free. So everything I'm going to show here is completely free to use. In fact, you can deploy this if you want. And I'll let Fujio convince you why you shouldn't do that. But for the sake of getting up and running and using it, you're using systems that people actually use in production. So I'm not going to go ahead and download this because you never know what happens when that happens. So I've already got it downloaded. So when you get it for a server, you'll end up with a zip file that you just unpack. So that's really easy. And here, this is I'm daring the demo demons because I actually did delete my Couchbase server. So all of this is going to be as if it's a blank system. I'm not cheating here. So I got to grab that. All I need to do is not fumble around too much and dump it into applications. And so I just drag the one app in. Why is it at the bottom? Why is everything upside down? Okay. Fire it off. Apple likes to try and protect you. We like to tell Apple that we're adults. And lo and behold, you get two things that pop up. Oh, I forgot to delete something. Shoot.
Just reverse listed. Just scroll down.
There we go. Yay. Okay. Now this is the pretty page that you're supposed to see the first time. I sent some editing in my future. Okay, so we downloaded it, we unzipped it, popped it open, and we get the setup. So it comes with a bunch of defaults. You could actually just pick all these. So you see it's just set for localhost to begin with. I will go ahead, I don't want to use up all of my RAM here. Not that it would necessarily screw me up, but it doesn't hurt to limit it. So I usually just stick in 2 gig. So that's the only thing I do in the first field. We have a number of sample data sets.
Can you zoom in?
Oh yeah.
There you go.
So, who doesn't like to sample beer? Bad jokes, I know. Again, here you could leave it to, so a bunch of the defaults, so things like bucket settings. So what you're seeing here is Couchbase, so working as a persistent store versus working as a memory cache. The amount of size dedicated to a particular bucket, so the default bucket. So buckets, that's one thing to understand in server. The terminology is a little bit different than other databases. So something like MySQL, when you look at those, the databases are kind of the sub-object that you use to organize your information. And a lot, logically grouped information usually goes into separate databases. And Couchbase, we actually call Couchbase Server the database, and buckets are sort of the equivalent of the database, in that they're the way you kind of organize data that's logically associated. So what I'm configuring right now is that when you first install this, you get a default bucket name, spectacularly default. And I'm going to set up the amount of memory that I'm going to use for that bucket. So if I develop and I'm creating like a whole bunch of buckets, you might set different amounts of memory for those, and those would kind of correspond to how much data you're putting into them. And then there's a bunch of other things here that you can just accept the default. So basically what you're seeing is that there's a couple things I can configure for my dev environment to get going that are kind of nice to have, but are actually not critical. You can pretty much just blow through this if you want. Notifications, we like to tempt people to give us their email, but you actually don't have to do that. That's a dirty secret that I'll give you. And then you set your password, which I will cleverly set the password, and bang, you're done. So you can actually see it in action here where it's loading. It's now loading up that beer sample database, and we can see some things like this measure of the number of operations. So you'll see it ramp up really for a short bit here while it loads up that sample data. And it's up and running. So right now, just to kind of explore this interface, we have one node, the localhost node. You can get some information on what's going on there. Fujio is going to show you some cool things with node failover and a multi-node system. The buckets, so we have the default one that I mentioned, and then we have the beer sample bucket. And actually, just to take a quick look, I was talking about the data being stored in JSON. So that's actually an example of the information about a particular beer from a particular brewery that's stored in the database and gives you an idea of how it's represented in the JSON. I'm not really going to talk too much about views, and right now I don't actually have an index. So we will actually move on to that. So that's, you can see that you have a nice administration panel here that you can, play around with. And of course, you've seen what it takes to install and what it takes to uninstall and do things. So you can play around with this, get it completely screwed up, go delete it, and start all over again. So.
Can you do the same from the terminal as well, all this?
So yes, you can, and I'm going to show you a couple of those things. So excellent question, a nice lead in. So actually what I'm going to show you is this tool called CBQ to start with. And CBQ is actually a command line shell for doing what we call nickel queries. So Couchbase, one of the cool things, despite being a NoSQL database, is that we have this language called nickel, NIQL, that is actually a superset of SQL. And so if you're used to SQL, you can actually just use Couchbase pretty much out of the box the way you're used to. And to illustrate that, I'm going to go ahead and so we saw that it was telling me, I'm going to do this the easier way, hopefully. So normally you would want to add this to your path. So this is the installation on Macs, sticks it in this slightly obscure location under your applications in its application install area. So your bin directory, there's a whole bunch of tools in here. I'm actually going to talk about CBQ in particular. So you pop that up and you've got your shell that you're in. And I'm going to go ahead and create the primary index, and you'll see this looks pretty much just like SQL. And there I got my success status, and if we flip over, we can see that it created the primary index off of that sample data that we have. So at that point, you're ready to go.
How big is the sample data?
I actually don't know. Do you know, Fujio?
7,200 documents. It's pretty, really, yeah, okay.
Very small.
It is quite a good listing of beers if you're...
I was going to say, if I could find it.
Somebody put some effort in because there are like phone numbers and things in there. It's like, okay, if you really need this particular one, call them up. So then the other piece that I wanted to show here is actually doing a query. So that's showing the result of what we had expected. So here, and this is a little bit, let me actually, people can read the screen pretty well.
Yeah. What's the link to this web page?
So this actually isn't up yet. This is something I'll be blogging about. So if you look at the Couchbase blogs, hopefully before the end of the month, all this stuff will be up there. If not, blame Java 1. So let me show a query in action. I think I just copied that, but. So there I got, it was typical kind of, let me flip back and forth so you can kind of see the whole thing. Selecting categories from the beer sample where the type is beer. And you're looking for like imperial and then order it in a particular way. And so just like a typical SQL query, and out comes the imperial stout, North American ale here. So basically ones that all have style, an imperial style beer. So you can do a bunch of things from, test out your queries and things from the command line instead of having to go code them or things like that, which is nice. You can also do a whole ton of things through the REST endpoint. So basically everything, pretty much every way you want to manipulate the database is exposed through REST endpoints. And so just to show a couple of things really quick. So HTTP is that utility that I talked about that I can't pronounce. Whoops. Did not copy that. So there I went to the endpoint. So this is the nodes endpoint. So this is a bunch of information about all the nodes that are running. And if we zip back up here, you can see things like about the buckets that are in there. And all sorts of other nice information, your memory quota. So you saw when I put in the 2 gigabytes before, that's showing up here. You've got your database, the default database that it's talking about here. All that kind of information. Another thing to look at is maybe you want information about a particular bucket. So in this case, the default here is actually referring to the name of the bucket. So like I should get different results if I'm put in beer sample instead of default. Let me actually do that. Put my money where my mouth is. I probably typed something wrong.
So you had it sort of right. So go back up again, and then / the name of the bucket that you want. So this is all the buckets.
Oh, right. Okay, yeah.
So you want buckets, right?
Oh, right. Sorry, yeah, right.
Buckets.
And then beer.
And then the beer sample, right?
Sample, yeah, that's right. There we go.
There you go. So that's the JSON.
Yeah. Okay. So like I say, there's for a server side, there's a just enormous number of REST endpoints that can allow you to control everything. So if you want to be building scripts to do stuff and populate your data, monitor things, all this, so in fact, I don't want to go over that because the administrator panel is really nice, and there's lots of good documentation about the endpoints and examples about how to use them. Actually, let me just give it a real. Where did I go? There we go. So if you drill down here, we've got things like the full text search, which is new. So that's actually supported in 4.5, not the 4.1 Community Edition, in the Enterprise Edition right now. So and actually being able to do like your nickel queries straight from a REST endpoint, so command line. So you can do pretty much everything you want. In fact, more than a lot more than you can do through the interface. Okay, so that's what I wanted to cover for Couchbase Server. So now, and the reason is partly actually will kind of go to your point in a way, is that Sync Gateway doesn't have as nice an administrative interface, and so knowing how to manipulate it through the REST endpoints is kind of more important. Excuse me. Okay, so Sync Gateway, the setup for that is actually even easier than. So I'm going to go ahead and kill some of this stuff. Or no, actually I want to save it for later. So again, you go to downloads, but this time we separate server from mobile with this tab up at the top. There's the Enterprise and the Community Edition. There's not really a whole lot of difference between them.
Yeah, currently there's almost no difference.
There's almost no difference between them. So I did check the MD5 signatures are different, so there's something in the package that's. But
a little bit. So usually the enterprise customers, they get the newer bug fixes. So we just released this yesterday.
Yeah.
But the newer customers could have gotten this before yesterday, or the enterprise customers could have gotten this before yesterday.
Okay. So yeah, actually, and I forgot, I wanted to announce that we actually just released an update. So we were at 1.3.0 and now we're up to 1.3.1. So a bug fix release that went out last night. So we got the latest and greatest going here. So again, this is actually going to download a tar file. So I'm not sure why we zip one and tar the other one, but fortunately Macs don't really care. So you would just open this and it would unpack. I actually have it unpacked already in a different thing. So the thing is that in this case, you don't have anything that you put in your applications directory. You're going to wind up, it's going to unpack into this, and this is what you're going to end up running from the command line. So you actually need to know where you unpacked it and be able to navigate to your bin directory for that. And I cleverly already set myself up that way. So here we go. So besides having the executable there, I want to highlight that we have a whole bunch of example configuration files for Sync Gateway here. And I'm going to use one of these right out of the box. So here we see this is a very simple one. So basically it says log everything, describing one database that's named DB. We're allowing it, you access it through localhost. There's actually a few different ports, but that kind of gives you the base port that you're working off of. It's going to match to, on the server side, to the default bucket. So, and here we're allowing open access to it. So there's a special guest account, and if you set it up this way, can people read that in the back? I hope. So with those settings, you're basically just setting it open. So this is a nice way to start, right? Because everything's just going to work. You're not going to run into things like authentication issues or other things until you get used to it some. And then when, of course, when you want to start applying authentication, you'll figure that out. So then I'm going to go ahead and fire up Sync Gateway side. So that's all it takes. It's just command line, and we'll see it immediately start spitting out some logs to show that it's up and going. And so this is already actually going to be talking to my Couchbase backend, just because of everything that comes rolled out of the box. So now that we have Sync Gateway up, let's take a look at some ways to play with that. So here, just to kind of verify that it's up and running, let me flip over here. So if so Sync Gateway actually has two primary ports that you care about. There's the public port and the administrative port. So the administrative one, I always get these backwards. The administrative one is 4985. Since I've got it wide open right now, it doesn't really matter which one you go to. So when I do that, it's going to pop up. It's going to give you this nice little welcome message and show you that it's alive and ticking. Again, lots of documentation on other REST endpoints, but here I want to show, so I'm actually going to walk through creating a document, and we can see some of the things that go on and some issues that people run into with this. So here I'm doing a put, and the name of the document, and at the end of the path, and then I'm just adding one field to it and filling it with a simple string. So we'll do that. We got it okay. And actually, one of the probably most important thing to see here is this revision ID that showed up. So you remember when I talked about how it resolves conflicts here. So here you're actually seeing part of the mechanism that tracks the history of what's going on. So what you've got is I forgot how we refer to it, the sequence number. Well, it's not the sequence number, it's the
Revision ID.
revision ID.
Yeah.
So, well, the whole thing we refer to as a revision ID, but you have the generation number. So, this is generation 1 of the document. So this actually helps you track, it helps Sync Gateway and the whole Couchbase Mobile track back to the history. So when it sees, a document with the same generation number and the same hash here, so this is where it's a little bit like Git, in that you're taking a hash of the contents of the document and getting a unique value out of that, much like Git does to track a lot of what goes on there. So if I track back through this and I see that I have the same generation number and the same hash, I know it's the same document. If I track back and it's a different generation number or a different hash, I know that I must have a conflict going on. So here, in fact, we'll show that you can't update the document without supplying the revision. So here I'm trying to update the document, and I didn't supply a revision number, and it just tells me document's already there, I don't know what you're trying to do, basically. So instead, I have to go in and this one I should probably do from, well, we'll see. So it's kind of cool and actually shows you that hash is derived from the contents, because, so this time I'm doing it the right way, which is supplying the revision number. And you notice I actually just copied that revision number from my previous walking through this, and it worked because it's the same hash. And you see that the generation number bumped up, and now I've got a different hash, completely different hash in there after updating the document. Does that all make sense? And we saw actually in that diagram that I had earlier what we call a tombstone revision, and that's what gets left, because you can't just remove the document when you delete it, because you'll lose that history and you'll lose track of whether or not there's conflicts in updating. So somebody else might have made an update to a document when you deleted it, and you need to be able to track that. So instead of just removing the document, we actually create what we call a tombstone revision. A tombstone revision is basically just an empty document that's marked as being deleted. So it looks like a lot like a normal document update. And actually we get to see, this is a really cool thing to do when you're starting out in this, is to actually see what's happening in Sync Gateway. So we have what we call the changes feed that you can monitor. And you can do this, programmatically. Of course, I mean, since these are REST endpoints, of course, you can build all this into an app if you want. And so here I'm just going to stream for a moment, and we can actually see. So I told it in effect to start telling me the changes from as far back as it had logged, and so it spit out a bunch of the history, including that the document sequence is. So that's actually telling you what would be the next sequence. The next in the generation would be number 4. So we made enough changes that we've got document number 3, generation up through 3 in there. And so that's kind of important, because if you want to track changes, you want to go back and ask, gather some of the data and then go back and say, give me the stuff starting from where I am and moving forward. And that's how you do that, is by pulling this number out. And you can see that it's marked as deleted. And if you notice that it just popped there, that was part of the heartbeat, because it's just sitting there listening to what's going on. So that's a great way to monitor everything that's happening in there. So now I mentioned very briefly the sync function. So sync gateway is actually this really cool in that you can write this very flexible function to control things that we call the sync function. You actually write it in JavaScript. So what we have here, I'll show you the basic sync function. And there's also this other cool thing that's built in. So there's this, I don't know where the name Walrus came from, but Walrus is actually a on-device database for a sync gateway. So if you don't want to actually connect it to a backend and you just want to play around with sync gateway, you set it up with a Walrus database, and then it effectively acts like a memory cache for you, or you can even persist locally on whatever device you're running sync gateway on. So you actually don't even need Couchbase Server if you want it. You can do a whole bunch of things just with sync gateway alone. So in this case, and this is going to show an example of dealing with channels. So here, this is the default sync gateway function. Is that it looks at the document. So you get the new version of the document and you get an old version of the document, so you can compare them. Your sync function needs to not reference anything externally. So it's always going to produce the same output given the same inputs. A very common thing is to file things into channels. Like I said, is a way to logically organize streams out to different users potentially. And so the actual built-in default is to do what we're showing here, which is it looks to see if the document has a property called channels, and if it does, it assigns it to a channel by that name. And the reason that I want to show that in particular is because this can trip you up, in that you can actually, so I'm going to switch over to this configuration. I need to check something. I think this is actually, yeah, this is the wrong one. So there isn't an example that's quite this simple, so I just cut a few things out and made a really simple example. So this shows, the access control for the user and using the default and so I'm going to go ahead and, so now I've got sync gateway running based on that configuration. And then what I'm going to do with that is show you that, you can write a document. So I've got the document here, and you'll see at the end there that I'm setting the channels to something. So I'm basically prepping myself to have a channel here. So I'll go ahead and write that into the database and see that it came back fine. Now, what trips people up is that you might think that because you were able to write that to the database that you can read it back. And what it turns out is that in that configuration, I didn't actually set up to authorize the user to read from that channel yet. So, in fact, it bounced that request. But what's neat beyond that is that now I can actually go and assign that channel from the command line. So here I'm actually sending configuration information to Sync Gateway on the fly. So I added user Adam to the ABC channel. For some reason we call the property admin channels because you're administering the channels. And so now that he's got access to that admin channel, we'll see that this time when I try and pull the document, it allows it. So that's a nice kind of example of playing around with Sync Gateway and potentially debugging some kind of issue. Because like I said, that's something that trips people up a reasonable amount. So yeah, that's it for Sync Gateway. And again, there's a lot more I could dive into with this, but hopefully that kind of gives you a feel for that. And I think Fujio will run over some things. And as I suspected, this is running into a long talk, so I'm going to run really quickly. So here we have just to show how to use Couchbase Lite. I built this sample app that's going to read a Twitter feed. The only kind of trick to it, this is how I set up the dependencies using Gradle. So I'm not showing you the download. Basically what I want to get to is I'm not showing you how to download Couchbase Lite because typically you would want to use it through something like Maven or Gradle to actually deal with the dependencies for you and do all the downloading. So even though there is a download section for Couchbase Lite on the downloads page, most people end up ignoring it. This is what you would use in Android Studio. I'm actually just doing it as a straight Java app here. This shows you how to get up and going. You remember we talked about the name of the database. So here, once again, we see that DB name showing up. So these 3 lines of code are all it takes to actually open up the database. And actually, am I cheating? I'm cheating. Sorry. Two lines of code. So this is actually the piece that sets up some of the principal things. So this is where I just have a helper class that does a few things. This is where you get a database manager and then you can open up a database. So this is where this is where, again, the terminology is a little funny because on Couchbase Lite, we refer to the logically grouped things as a database again instead of calling them buckets. So we're back to more like the MySQL kind of terminology. So I open up a database that's named DB. And so, of course, like I said, that kind of will automatically feed into how the backend that I have set up is. Actually, let me make sure that I'm running the right version.
Does the version never have to match, or?
What I want is the configuration file. So this sample configuration file that I'm using I know has the right database name. I'm not sure what I named it in the other one. So that's the only. So let me just illustrate that. But, so yeah, so in this being that really simple wide open one that's got the database named in there. And then actually here's the code to start up the synchronization, so the push and pull. So synchronizing in Couchbase Lite is directional, so you have to set up both a pull and a push. We set it up to continuous, so basically all this code in here is just setting up. In this section is setting up the replication. It's pretty typical if you just want things kind of to fire up and be replicating your data to your back end all the time. You would set it up for to be continuous replication and then start it off. And then I actually, in here, what I'm doing is I have I use a Twitter library, and this is a callback. This stream listener is a callback that's getting the feed. I'm actually getting JSON from the Twitter feed. I dump that into a map and create a new document and dump the map into the document. And actually, this put properties here not only updates the document, but it actually causes it to be persisted right there. So it's writing into the database with that all in one bundle. So I think maybe I'll just save it for afterwards if people actually want to see this, but this actually will sit there and watch my Twitter feed going. We can play around, like if people want to see, I can show like pulling documents and you can see what a Twitter feed looks like. It's actually got an enormous amount of information in it. But that kind of gives you an idea of how simple it is to get up and actually using the database in an application. This is actually probably significantly more complicated than I needed to show, but it's still pretty straightforward. So with that, I think I will call this part of the evening done.